Captain David Rifkin of the Billfish. This is Bill Nowicki saying thank you for listening to the #1 submarine podcast out there, Submarine Sea Stories. Tell a couple friends about the show, will you please? And do a review on the Apple Podcast app or wherever you get your podcast. Please tell a couple friends about the show and tell a couple friends about the show. Anyway, this is Bill Nowicki for Submarine Sea Stories.
As part of their attribution. It was a very sensitive thing at the time. Here we are 15 years later, and we have a whole podcast series about Chinese cyber espionage. The reason I felt that it was critical we do this on Chinese cyber espionage is because this is the threat that in some ways I lived and breathed at the New York Times, but it's the threat that has been gnawing at me ever since I left the New York Times. Because I feel that I failed and that media failed and business failed, and in some ways government failed to really connect the dots for the people on this particular threat. We never went back to Nortel, for instance, when it went bankrupt. And, when they wrote all these bankruptcy stories, no one ever mentioned, well, actually the company was hacked by China several years ago. Huawei owns all that IP. They've been subsidizing it, rolling it into global markets, and now Nortel is gone. And we never did that with solar companies. We never did it with turbine makers. We never did it with electric vehicles now. China is now the biggest manufacturer of electric vehicles. It's no longer Tesla as of 2023. We never did it with electric vehicle batteries. We never did it with home routers. Now it's Chinese companies that own the US home router market, as Rob actually testified to Congress the other day. These are routers that have been used in attacks on American critical infrastructure. In fact, just today I went on Amazon and looked up a TP-Link home router. It is Amazon's #1 overall pick, and they own something like 60% market share of US home routers. And these home routers have been used to funnel attacks into America's critical infrastructure. It's not a hypothetical threat, it's a real threat. And all of this has been going on kind of right under our noses, but we've never really connected the dots. So really the magic of this episode, of tonight, of where we are, is that sitting next to me are the people who are the dots, and we are about to connect them. On my left here is my former colleague, David Barbosa, who will always be a colleague in my heart. David was the Shanghai bureau chief for the New York Times. He is the reason that we were actually hacked at the New York Times. His coverage was that good. It earned him a Pulitzer, but it also earned him the wrath of the CCP. And I wrote that story for the New York Times. We actually have our former CTO, Rajiv, in the audience today, so we remember that very well. And I remember when the hack first happened, we thought they were there to maybe shut us down. But very quickly it became clear, nope, they were there for David, and more specifically, David's sources. These days, David is the co-founder of The Wire China, which is doing some fantastic data journalism and news journalism, traditional journalism on China. So it's an honor to have you here today. To his left is Rob Joyce. Until very recently, Rob Joyce was head of cybersecurity at NSA. He served at the agency for something like 34 years, right? And had a very storied career there, including leading the Tailored Access Operations Unit at NSA, which is the agency that conducts hacking on behalf of our foreign intelligence collection program. So he knows better than anyone what the Chinese capabilities are. To his left is Jen Easterly, who until very recently was the director of CISA, the nation's cyber defense agency. And before that was actually head of global security at Morgan Stanley. And before that, also had a storied career at NSA, which included standing up Cyber Command. And it's an honor to have her here today. To her left was my favorite phone call at the New York Times, Jim Lewis. I called him every time there was a cybersecurity disaster brewing. Jim, until very recently also, was Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, which tells you nothing about Jim. What you need to know about Jim is that Jim has been privy to, partaken in, supported almost every back channel negotiation that the US has had with China on the cyber threat. And then to his left is Bipul Sinha, the CEO and co-founder of Rubrik, which is leading the charge on cyber resiliency in this country and making sure that our worst day, the day you get hacked, is not your last day. So all of you, these are the people who have been targeted by, instrumental in tracking and engaging the Chinese cyber espionage threat. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to ask the first question to my friend David here, which I want to address right away the elephant in the room. And I think the elephant in the room is this, covering this threat at the New York Times and doing a whole podcast series about Chinese cyber espionage. You are walking a very tight rope because this is a very real threat, but you also don't want to stoke the kinds of disgusting xenophobia that we saw during COVID. And it is a tough rope to walk. And I think you have covered these threats, you've been a target of these threats, and now you are basically covering China full time through the wire. So help explain how do you walk this tightrope, and how do you help, for the novices to the subject, help them conceptualize this difference between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people?
Yes, thank you. Great to be here with you, Nicole. I think this is one of the things, it's a great journalism question. It's also great that your first episode mentions, we need to deal with this issue. As a journalist covering China, you've got to write about the Communist Party, you've got to write about the toughest things that China's doing. Hacking my own email. But also, that's going to affect the readers, that's going to affect politicians, that's going to lead to a little xenophobia. As you probably know, there's FBI investigations, there's concerns about Chinese students at universities. You may or may not know this, but the 3 major American chip companies are all Chinese Americans. So China is a source of talent. You have just discrimination, human rights, all of those things. So I think as a journalist, maybe the first years I was in China wasn't a big deal, but every year since then, especially now, you have to think in journalism, but not only in journalism, about what is the story? Is it the Chinese actors, the Chinese cyber spies? Could that become easily seen as Chinese? These are suspicions about Chinese students, or my colleague is Chinese, my wife is Chinese. So I do worry a lot about that. I think every story we write, we need to think about not only is it true what we're saying, but what could be the impact of this story? Could it lead to xenophobia in the country?